recording.
Hi, this is Tammy Tyree, Echoes of Our Ancestors, African American History and Song. I'm going to talk for a moment about Motown and its relationship to Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. Now, that doesn't seem like a very likely combination, but I guess the overall question that I'm trying to answer in my mind is, was Motown responsive to the social upheaval that surrounded the world and the country in particular during its heyday in the 1960s? Let's think about that. Motown was, by the time 1968 occurred, an already extremely well-established record company formed by blacks, run by blacks, with most of its artists being black and most of its musicians being black. However, Berry Gordy, beginning in the 1950s, when he first started his record company, had very broad visions about where he wanted to take his music and who he wanted it to appeal to. And it was not just exclusively black people. He knew a whole lot about the 1920s and 1930s race music that came out, music that was packaged and marketed exclusively for black people, with the assumption that white people would not understand or appreciate it. That is not what the Motown sound was all about. It was the sound of young America. That was the slogan. And while segregation was happening all around, and while the March on Washington took place, and while the sexual revolution prior to 1968 was brewing in the country, Motown successfully steered clear of these topics in its music. Motown and Berry Gordy was about music. And you could ask the question, even today, are artists responsible for being activists and for discussing social justice issues throughout their art? Maybe yes, maybe no. But at that particular time, Berry Gordy was very clear that he did not want his music to have strong social statements. He was a record company that focused primarily on the evolution and development of groups, boy groups and girl groups. And since we're talking a lot about the girl groups of Motown today, know that girl groups in general, a genre that started in the 1950s, really spoke to what girls were thinking about, young girls in particular, high school girls and girls in their low 20s. And the 1950s and early 1960s young woman was thinking about meeting a guy, going steady, falling in love, and getting married and having a family and children. That is what Motown was founded on. Guy meets girl, girl meets guy, and the good, the bad, and the ups and downs of being in a romance. And that is what was universal at that time around young girls, young boys, and that is why Motown was able to stay hot, relevant, and current during the turmoil of the 1960s. Now, I'm not going to say whether that was good or bad, but Berry Gordy, the great entrepreneur, had a vision and he stuck with it, and it was successful. However, in 1968, when all of the social turmoil had come to a boiling pot and exploded with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., it was almost impossible to not respond. And so the question is, Did Motown respond? Well, I say they did. I'd like to give you a few examples of how the music changed radically after or right upon the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Here are some songs from their repertoire. First of all, in 1968, Motown's #1 girl group and the most successful girl group, black or white, of its time, the Supremes, recorded Love Child, written for them exclusively. And guess what it was about? It was about a young girl having a baby out of wedlock. This is something that would have never been discussed by any girl group prior to that time. Then the Supremes came back in 1969 and recorded I'm Living in Shame, written by their favorite songwriting team, Holland, Dozier, Holland. This song was about a young girl who achieves fame and great wealth, who came from the poorest of poor and had a mother who she was ashamed of. And when her mother passed, she came face to face with the dreadful realization that she had ignored her mother once she became rich and famous, and the song was about her regrets. So that song, you could say, was dealing with the black upwardly mobile who could not face the poverty of the past. In 1970, Stevie Wonder on the Tamala label came out with Heaven Help Us All. Beautiful lyrics, very social justice minded. And in 1970, we had a real chart buster with a new artist, a relatively new artist. He'd only had one hit prior, Edwin Starr. Edwin Starr sang the Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong collaboration, War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. It skyrocketed right up to #1. Now it's interesting. Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong had been on the staff of Motown for a while, not writing some of the biggest hits because Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong were always wanting to write songs with a social conscience, and they weren't able to get a lot of them through. They had actually recorded War with the Temptations on one of the Temptations albums. They wanted Berry Gordy to cut that song as a single on the Temptations, but he wouldn't do it because he felt that that would be risking the Temptations' great reputation. Now, in 1971, we had the most important social justice anthem of all. And I do not think many people, black or white, would argue with me about this. That What's Going On by Marvin Gaye was probably the most important song of the civil rights movement to hit the R&B and pop charts. Yes, it came out on Tamla, and these songs are songs that I believe would have never been recorded by Motown prior to Martin Luther King's assassination. What I want you to consider is that while we certainly do not think of Motown as being a record company that promoted music of social justice, let us not say that the artists and the writers and the staff of Motown were not responsive to the social upheaval of the day. And remember, these important songs, and I'm sure there are others, but these are the ones that were chart topping during the period. And I believe that it all happened as a response to the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. This is Tammy Tyree, Echoes of Our Ancestors, African American History and Song.